Okay, are you ready? We're going deep today. Deep into the world of cannabinoids and cancer. Um, More specifically, how they might actually be able to help fight cancer.
Yeah, it's a hot topic
And
and
it is. It is.
yeah.
You give me some pretty intense research material for this one.
It's a pretty complex area, a lot of moving parts.
PhD level stuff. Like we're talking about how cannabinoids could affect tumor growth, how they might stop cancer from spreading, even trigger those cells to self-destruct. I mean,
It's pretty amazing what we're learning about this system.
it is.
Hmm.
So to even start to wrap our heads around this whole thing, let's go back to the basics. Like, how did we even discover that our bodies have this whole system that interacts with cannabinoids in the first place?
Well, it is a remarkable story. It all started back in the early 90s with Dr. Raphael Mechoulam and his team.
Oh yeah, Dr. Macholam, the pioneer.
Exactly. He was doing some groundbreaking work, and they ended up stumbling upon what we now call the endocannabinoid system.
Okay, so they found this whole system in our bodies. We're talking like a network of receptors and signals, and it all interacts with cannabinoids.
Exactly. And they identified these key molecules that act like the body's own internal cannabinoids.
Anandamide and 2-HE, right?
Got it.
So our bodies able to produce their own versions of these compounds.
Exactly. And it turns out this system is involved in a whole bunch of physiological processes, like
Yeah.
everything from mood regulation and pain perception to immune function and even protecting our brains.
So it's not just about getting high.
Oh, no, no, not at all. This is a fundamental system that plays a role in keeping our bodies balanced and healthy.
So how does it all work? I mean, what's the mechanism behind all this?
Well, it all boils down to these things called cannabinoid receptors.
Like our receptors.
Hmm.
So we have these receptors in our bodies that specifically interact with cannabinoids.
Right. And there are two main types, CB1 and CB2.
Okay, CB1, CB2, I've heard those before.
These receptors are like little docking stations on the surface of our cells. When a cannabinoid, whether it's from a plant or produced by our own bodies, binds to one of these receptors.
It's like a key fitting into a lock.
Perfect analogy. It triggers a cascade of events inside the cell. It's like a chain reaction, a domino effect.
So it's not just about the cannabinoid binding, it's about what happens next.
Exactly. The binding is just the first step. It sets off a whole series of signals that can have a wide range of effects on the cell.
Okay, so this is where we get into all those complex signaling pathways, right? The
Mhm.
acronyms, the G proteins, CMP, all that jazz.
Yeah, we're going to have to dive into some of that. But it's actually pretty fascinating once you start to understand the players involved.
Well, let's give it a shot. Break it down for us.
So these cannabinoid receptors are a type of G protein coupled receptor, or GPCR for short.
GPCR. Okay, got it.
These GPCRs are like the cellular messengers. They relay signals from the outside world to the inside of the cell. When a cannabinoid binds to a GPCR, it causes a conformational change in the receptor.
A conformational change. So it changes shape.
Yeah, exactly. It's like flipping a switch on the receptor.
So that's how the signal gets transmitted to the inside of the cell.
Exactly. And once that switch is flipped, it activates these things called G proteins.
Okay, G proteins. Tell me more about them.
Well, G proteins are made up of different subunits, alpha, beta, and gamma, and they're responsible for carrying the signal further down the line.
Like a relay race.
Exactly. Each runner passing the baton to the next, amplifying the signal along the way.
I'm starting to get the picture. So we've got the cannabinoid binding to the receptor, activating the G protein. And then what? What does this signal actually do inside the cell?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. It depends on the specific type of G protein that's activated. Some G proteins, like JAS, stimulate the production of a molecule called cyclic AMP or CAMP.
Cyclic AMP.
CAMP is a second messenger. It amplifies the signal and triggers even more downstream effects.
Okay, so it's like amplifying the message even further.
Exactly. Now, other G proteins like Dungio actually do the opposite. They inhibit CMP production. So
Oh.
depending on which G protein is involved, you can have either a stimulatory or inhibitory effect.
Wow, so it's a delicate balance. It's like a complex network of checks and balances inside the cell.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. These pathways can also affect other molecules like calcium ions, and they can even activate other enzymes like protein kinase A or PKA.
Okay, I'm trying to keep up. We've got G proteins, KMP, PKA. It's a lot of players involved.
It is, and the interactions between these players can get really complex. But the key takeaway here is that these pathways are crucial for controlling cell behavior, and cannabinoids can actually influence them.
Okay, so we're talking about how cannabinoids can actually affect what cells do, how they grow, how they behave.
Exactly. And that means they could potentially have a direct impact on cancer cells.
Ah, so this is where the cancer connection comes in.
Precisely. And one of the key downstream pathways affected by cannabinoid signaling is the MAPK pathway.
MAPK pathway, another acronym.
I know, bear with me. The MAPK pathway is involved in regulating cell growth, survival, and even cell death. And it has three main branches, ERK, JNK, and P38, each with its own role in these processes.
ERK, JNK, P38. It's like a whole alphabet soup of acronyms here.
I know it can get pretty overwhelming, but the key takeaway here is that these pathways are crucial for controlling cell behavior, and cannabinoids can actually influence them. That means they could potentially have a direct impact on cancer cells.
So are we saying that by tweaking these signaling pathways, cannabinoids could potentially stop cancer cells from growing or even make them self-destruct?
That's the idea. And there's actually some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that this might be the case.
Okay, so let's dive into the evidence. What kind of studies have been done to actually show that cannabinoids can affect cancer cells?
Well, researchers have been looking at this for a while now, both in lab studies and in some early clinical trials. One of the areas they've focused on is how cannabinoids impact cancer cell growth, and what they've found is pretty intriguing.
Give us the details. What have they discovered?
They've discovered that certain cannabinoids like CBD and THC can actually inhibit the growth of certain cancer cell lines in the lab. For example, one study found that CBD significantly slowed the growth of cholangiocarcinoma cells.
Cholangiocarcinoma cells.
It's a type of cancer that affects the bile ducts.
Okay, so they're literally seeing these cancer cells stop multiplying when exposed to cannabinoids.
Exactly. And it seems like this growth inhibition might be linked to those signaling pathways we were talking about earlier. Cannabinoids might be interfering with the signals that tell cancer cells to grow and divide.
It's like they're cutting off the fuel supply to the cancer cells. That's incredible.
Mm.
But what about metastasis, the spread of cancer to other parts of the body? Can cannabinoids have any effect on that?
That's another area where researchers are seeing some promising results. While the mechanisms aren't fully understood, yet studies suggest that cannabinoids might be able to interfere with the processes that allow cancer cells to detach from the primary tumor and travel to distant sites.
So it's like they're disrupting the cancer cell's escape plan, preventing them from spreading and causing more damage.
Exactly. It's almost like they're setting up roadblocks to prevent the cancer cells from migrating.
This is fascinating stuff. But let's talk about the most dramatic possibility, apoptosis or programmed cell death. Is there any evidence that cannabinoids can actually trigger cancer cells to self-destruct?
Now that's where things get really interesting. There's growing evidence that certain cannabinoids can actually trigger apoptosis in cancer cells.
Okay, so apoptosis. We've heard that term before. But remind us what it means.
It's basically programmed cell death. It's like the cell's self-destruct mechanism.
So it's like a built-in safety feature.
Exactly. It's a way for the body to get rid of damaged or unwanted cells, like cells that have become cancerous.
Okay, so you're saying that these cannabinoids can actually trigger this self-destruct sequence in cancer cells.
That seems to be the case, and
Great.
it's a pretty powerful process.
But how does it actually work? I mean, what's going on at the molecular level to make this happen?
Well, apoptosis is a complex process. It involves a cascade of molecular events. And one of the key players in this cascade is a group of enzymes called caspases.
Caspases, another new term.
Think of them as the demolition crew. They're the ones that carefully dismantle the cell from the inside out.
So the cannabinoids are somehow activating these caspase, these cellular demolition experts, to take down the cancer cells.
That's what the research suggests. It seems like cannabinoids can activate specific pathways that lead to caspase activation, and ultimately that leads to the death of the cancer cell.
Wow, so it's like they're flipping the switch on this cellular suicide pathway.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting is that they seem to do this selectively. They target cancer cells while leaving healthy cells largely unharmed.
So that's what makes this whole area so exciting, right? The potential for targeted therapies. That we could specifically eliminate cancer cells without harming healthy tissue. It's like a surgical strike against cancer.
Exactly. That's the holy grail of cancer treatment. And cannabinoids seem to hold some real promise in this area.
Okay, so we've got these really intriguing lab studies showing that cannabinoids can inhibit cancer cell growth, potentially stop metastasis, and even trigger apoptosis. But what about real-world applications? I mean, how are these findings being translated into treatments for people who are actually battling cancer?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. As promising as these preclinical studies are, we need more research. We need more rigorous clinical trials to confirm these findings and to really determine the safety and efficacy of cannabinoid-based therapies in humans.
Right, because what works in a petri dish or in mice doesn't always translate directly to humans.
Okay.
So are there any clinical trials underway? Are researchers actually exploring the use of cannabinoids for cancer treatment in people?
Yes, absolutely. There's a growing number of clinical trials investigating the potential of cannabinoids in oncology, and these trials are looking at different approaches.
Tell us more. What kind of approaches are they exploring?
Well, some of these trials are looking at cannabinoids as adjuvants to conventional therapies.
Adjuvants? What does that mean?
It means they're being used alongside traditional cancer treatments, like chemotherapy or radiation.
Okay, so it's not necessarily about replacing existing treatments, but about finding ways to make them work better, or maybe to reduce the side effects.
Exactly. It's about using cannabinoids to enhance the effectiveness of conventional therapies or to make the experience more bearable for patients.
And are there trials looking at using cannabinoids as the primary treatment?
Yes, there are. Other trials are exploring the use of cannabinoids as standalone therapies.
So in those trials, they're not using chemo or radiation at all. It's just cannabinoids.
Exactly. And this approach is particularly interesting for cancers that haven't responded to conventional treatments or for patients who can't tolerate the harsh side effects of those treatments.
So it's like a last line of defense. Or maybe a gentler approach for people who are struggling with the more aggressive treatments.
You could think of it that way. And while it's still early days, the initial results from some of these clinical trials are actually quite encouraging.
Really? What have they found so far?
Well, for example, there have been studies showing that cannabinoids can help to reduce pain and improve quality of life for cancer patients.
That's huge, especially for people who are dealing with the debilitating effects of cancer and its treatments.
Absolutely. Even if they don't directly shrink the tumors, cannabinoids can make a big difference in terms of symptom management. And that can have a really positive impact on a patient's overall well-being.
It's not just about finding a cure, it's about making life better for people who are living with cancer.
Right. Absolutely. And that's something that's often overlooked. The potential of cannabinoids to alleviate those really distressing symptoms that often come with cancer, like pain, nausea, loss of appetite, it's significant.
It's like a multi-pronged approach.
Mm.
They're potentially attacking the cancer itself, but they're also helping patients to cope with the side effects of treatment and just to have a better quality of life.
Exactly. It's about treating the disease, but also caring for the whole person. And that's what makes this area of research so compelling.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation so far. We've gone from the discovery of the endocannabinoid system to the intricacies of cannabinoid signaling pathways and the potential of these compounds to fight cancer. But I keep coming back to one thing: the sheer complexity of it all. It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer we uncover new complexities, new possibilities.
It's true. The endocannabinoid system is so intricate, and we're only just beginning to understand its full potential. But that complexity is also what makes it so fascinating.
It's of these vast, uncharted territory. And every new discovery brings us closer to understanding how we can use this system for good. How we can harness its power for therapeutic benefit.
Absolutely. And I think that's what keeps researchers going. The potential is just so enormous.
But with all this complexity, it must be so challenging for researchers to actually figure out how to target these pathways for therapeutic purposes. I mean, are there specific challenges that they face when they're trying to develop cannabinoid-based therapies?
Absolutely. There are a number of hurdles that researchers need to overcome. And one of the biggest challenges is specificity.
Specificity. Remind me what that means in this context.
Well, remember we talked about those different cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, and how they're distributed throughout the body.
Yeah, they're all over the place, right?
Exactly. And that widespread distribution can make it really tricky to develop therapies that target specific tissues or organs without causing unwanted side effects.
Right, because if you're trying to target cancer cells in the lungs, for example, you don't want the therapy to also be affecting receptors in the brain or the immune system, right?
Exactly. You want to hit the cancer cells precisely without causing collateral damage. So finding ways to deliver cannabinoids specifically to the target tissue, that's a major area of research.
So it's not just about the cannabinoid itself, it's about how you deliver it.
Exactly. And there's a lot of work being done on developing targeted drug delivery systems.
Like little guided missiles that deliver the medication right to the cancer cells.
That's a good analogy. And these delivery systems are designed to minimize exposure to healthy tissues so they can reduce the risk of side effects.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But speaking of side effects, what are some of the concerns surrounding the use of cannabinoids for medical purposes?
Well, like any medication, cannabinoids can have side effects. Some of the more common ones include drowsiness, dizziness, dry mouth, and changes in mood.
Okay, so nothing too serious.
Right. For most people, the side effects are relatively mild. But for people with certain medical conditions like heart disease or psychiatric disorders, there may be additional risks.
So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution. And it's really important for people to use these compounds responsibly and under the guidance of a healthcare professional. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that we're still learning about the long-term effects of cannabinoid use, especially in the context of medical treatment. More research is needed to fully understand the potential risks and benefits.
Right. It's all about weighing those potential benefits against the potential risks.
Mhm.
And that's where ongoing research and those clinical trials we were talking about are so crucial. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's been generating a lot of buzz lately, the development of synthetic cannabinoids.
Yeah.
What are those all about, and how do they differ from the naturally occurring ones that we find in plants?
So, synthetic cannabinoids, they're basically like taking those natural cannabinoids, those blueprints, and kind of tweaking them in the lab, creating compounds that have really specific properties.
Oh, so they're manipulating the structure of the molecule.
Exactly. They might try to enhance the beneficial effects, maybe reduce any potential side effects, or even create totally new molecules that interact with the endocannabinoid system in completely different ways.
So it's like designer cannabinoids.
You could say that. It's like taking what nature has given us and then fine-tuning it for medical use.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But why would you want to use a synthetic version instead of just sticking with the natural ones?
Well, there are some real advantages. One of the biggest is precision.
Okay, precision.
With synthetic cannabinoids, you can create molecules that bind very specifically to certain receptors. You can avoid those off-target effects that we talked about earlier.
So, like, if you wanted to target the CB2 receptors, which are mostly found in the immune system, you could design a synthetic cannabinoid that wouldn't also affect the CB1 receptors in the brain, right?
Exactly. And that would minimize the psychoactive effects that people often associate with THC.
That's huge, especially if you're talking about medical applications where you really don't want those mind-altering effects.
Right. So it's all about fine-tuning that interaction with the endocannabinoid system to get the exact therapeutic outcome you're looking for.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
And what about consistency? Is that a factor too?
definitely. When you're working with plant-derived cannabinoids, the potency and composition can vary quite a bit.
Because of different strains of plant, growing conditions, things like that, right?
Exactly. But with synthetic cannabinoids, you can produce them with really high purity and consistency.
So you know exactly what you're getting every time.
Exactly. And that ensures a much more predictable and reliable dosage, which is obviously crucial when you're developing pharmaceuticals.
It's like the difference between using a pinch of salt versus a carefully measured teaspoon.
Exactly. You want to be precise, especially when it comes to medicine. And then there's also the possibility of creating completely new molecules that don't even exist in nature.
Okay, now that's where things get really interesting.
By tweaking that chemical structure of the cannabinoids, scientists can explore a huge range of possibilities, and they might even stumble upon compounds with entirely new therapeutic effects.
So it's like opening up this whole new world of drug discovery.
Exactly. It's
Right.
pretty exciting stuff, and there's so much more to explore. So zooming out a bit, looking at the big picture, what are some of the most exciting things on the horizon for cannabinoid research, especially when it comes to cancer?
Yeah, what's got you fired up these days?
Well, one area that's really got me excited is personalized medicine.
Okay, personalized medicine, tailoring treatments to each individual.
Exactly. As we learn more about this complex interplay between the endocannabinoid system and cancer and how individual genetic variations play into it all, we might actually be able to develop therapies that are specifically tailored to each patient's unique needs.
So not a one-size-fits-all approach, but a more individualized approach, taking into account each person's biology.
Exactly. That's the future of medicine, and cannabinoids are going to be a big part of that. And then there's also the potential of combination therapy.
Oh, right, combining cannabinoids with other treatments.
Exactly. Using them along with chemo, immunotherapy, or radiation to enhance their effectiveness or to reduce those nasty side effects.
So it's about finding ways to make those existing treatments work even better.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the ongoing exploration of the endocannabinoid system itself. The more we learn about this intricate system, the more we're going to uncover new therapeutic targets.
It's like this never-ending puzzle, right?
Exactly. And every piece we put in place brings us closer to understanding how we can manipulate this system to fight disease, and that includes cancer.
This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have, but hopefully it's given our listeners a good overview of this incredible field.
I think so. We've gone from the discovery of the endocannabinoid system to those complex signaling pathways and how cannabinoids might actually be able to combat cancer. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
It is. And the future is incredibly bright for cannabinoid research. I have no doubt that we're going to see even more groundbreaking discoveries in the years to come.
So what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive? What's the key message?
The endocannabinoid system is an incredibly powerful system, and we're only just beginning to tap into its therapeutic potential.
It's like we've discovered this whole new world inside our bodies, and it has the potential to revolutionize medicine.
Exactly. And that includes the fight against cancer. There are definitely challenges ahead, but the research is incredibly promising.
It's a reminder that we're living in a time of incredible scientific advancements, and cannabinoids are right at the forefront of all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the most important message is to never stop asking questions. Never stop being curious.
Because who knows? Maybe one of our listeners out there will be the one to make the next big discovery.
Exactly. That's what keeps science moving forward, that constant thirst for knowledge and that willingness to challenge the status quo.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of cannabinoids and their potential impact on cancer. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.